Hey, everybody. Welcome back. Hope you're having fun and enjoying the class. I've received quite a few emails from a lot of you with some good questions, great questions. Keep on top of the assignments the best you can. I know that things go pretty quick. Today, I'm going to try and help a little bit about Chapter 8 because Chapter 8 tends to have a lot of questions from students. Chapter 8 is about death investigations. And what I want you to remember, like almost every chapter that you read, most things in the criminal justice system uh, depends on the department that you work for. As much as I would love to say that all the agencies, 18,000 police agencies out there, that they all do the same things in the same way, it's just not the case. Uh, they try and do the things to be uh, as far as similar in the nature in which they go about things, but clearly every department's going to have their own way that they do things. The state law will determine who's contacted during these death investigations. So we're going to be just broadly touching on it and giving you that this is what the majority of states and the federal government, when they look at this topic, this is typically what they are faced with and how they answer the questions. So let's start off by first talking about when you get called or as an investigator to a death investigation, someone has passed on, and when we're there, we look at it in one of four ways. In a death investigation, first off, going back to my first class, don't jump to conclusions. Don't get involved in deductive reasoning. Try and be an inductive reasoner. Go in and take a look at all the different things that you're looking at. This is my buddy Odie. Kind of helps me out on a lot of investigations. Anyway, the four types of deaths that you will be faced with when you go on a call. Number one is going to be natural causes. We'll get into each one of these, but the cause of death would be based on natural causes. The second one would be accidental. The third one we put into the category of suicide. And then the fourth one we put into the category of a homicide. A homicide, remember, is probably the most confusing for students in that, remember, homicide, by definition, is a killing of a human being by another human being. Not all homicides are criminal. Keep that in mind. There are certainly times when human beings have to take the life of somebody else, whether it's in self-defense, military, during a war. So the word homicide can be either criminal or non-criminal. When we look at the two classes, we put it in classes, two classes of criminal homicide, meaning they violated state law. We put them in a category of murder and manslaughter. Non-criminal homicide, again, are those things that were unintentional for the most part, truly accidental, things that happened based on trying to protect somebody's life. You're authorized under state law to protect, allowing yourself to protect your family, your loved ones, anybody out there. So remember, we're going to break down really what murder and manslaughter really defined as criminal homicide. And the definition in most states of criminal murder is the killing of another human being with malice aforethought. And at this point, it seems simple. We don't really have to prove that there was any hatred involved, just the intent and they were unconcerned for the lives of others. So remember, it's the killing of another human being with malice aforethought. When we talk about first-degree murder, in different states, they'll define it a little bit different. But first-degree murder is really the idea that it was premeditated, that whoever did this was thinking about it beforehand. They were trying to put together a plan in many cases, but the idea of premeditation is it was planned before the event happened. And this is typically what first-degree murder is. Second-degree murder is the killing of another person without the element of premeditation. Certainly, sometimes life is taken, and someone really didn't plan on doing that. So, with second degree and third degree, for purposes of this class, just remember that it was not premeditated. It'll certainly be one of those categories that also fall under the definition of manslaughter. When we talk about manslaughter, it's the unlawful killing of another without malice or premeditation. But when we talk about manslaughter, we put it into two specific categories. We have voluntary and we have involuntary. Voluntary manslaughter is a killing that typically is done in the heat of passion. That things happened and transpired in this event. Premeditation didn't occur, but the emotions were extremely volatile, and someone in the heat of passion took somebody else's life. We consider that a voluntary manslaughter. As opposed to involuntary manslaughter, the death occurs while the person was involved in some type of act where they weren't doing what they were supposed to, that the rest of us stand back and we say, come on, you should have known better. So someone's life was taken as a result of their action or inaction. It could be something like leaving a child in a pool unattended when it's a very small child, leaving a child in a car unattended. Things like DUIs. People clearly don't go to bars for the most part and drink to the point where they can't drive a vehicle anymore. So there was no premeditation involved, but they got behind the wheel and somebody's life was taken. This is also considered involuntary manslaughter. So remember, put those two categories in the back of your head. Certainly when we start looking at punishment and how we punish, second-degree murder and third-degree murder sometimes can be very close in the elements of a crime. When we talk about manslaughter, really at that point, as a detective and an investigator, when we look into a death investigation, we give the details in all the specificity to the district attorney's office, and they will be the ones to decide which level to appropriately prosecute the suspect. So when we look at suicide, accidents, or criminal homicide, let's first talk about suicides. When we do a suicide investigation, many times there are not suicide notes. Many times we're faced with the crime scene, that we're trying to put together what happened here. And in many cases, we have to determine, was this actually someone that took their own life, premeditated this event? Many times it can appear that somebody staged this, put it together. There are many times when we have multiple people there, or a couple where we have two people that clearly someone took the life of another, but did they take their own life? Was it an accident? So when we talk about suicides, remember, we're going to be documenting in great detail all of the events to determine exactly whether we believe it was in fact suicide. Accidents are just that. When we look at a cause of death for an accident, it's a tragic event that occurred. Someone's life was lost, and it's not necessarily that someone did something or didn't do something. When I get asked by students, well, where does that accident draw a line with manslaughter? When we give it to a normal jury, people in a room getting together, think of yourself. If we give you the details of the death, and when you stand back and you go, wow, this person should have never done that. Firing a firearm. You're out there shooting a gun without proper backstops. And the rest of us are going, well, yeah, you didn't have proper backstops. That bullet trajectory absolutely should have at least crossed your mind that could have taken someone's life. So we look at it as if you should have known better. If you should have known better, then yes, that's when manslaughter becomes criminal. Accidental, or when we sit back and go, wow, no, it's tragic. Nobody really could have prepared for this or done something different. And tragically, accidents occur in many, many cases when we go on these death investigations. Keep in mind when we go as an investigator, we're going to be documenting it as a death. Obviously, someone there has died. Don't rush to judgment on our documentation, our police report. We don't have to put down which one of the 4 ways we believe it to be. Just put down it's a death investigation, that it's ongoing. We're trying to determine. We use the term equivocal. Equivocal means it's suspicious, that something about this crime scene just doesn't seem right. So when something's suspicious and we look at it as, in all the times that I've been on an investigation, this is typically what I am used to seeing. What I'm looking at now is not what I've normally seen. So when we go on a call and we see things in this call, we have an idea of this is what I've seen the last 100 times. When I am not faced with that, where something looks different, we call it an equivocal death, and we are certainly going to look into it further. We know, for instance, that in most cases, people that die of natural causes, and it could be someone old or young, they have a tragic illness. Most people that die of natural causes from an illness are being seen by a doctor. Whether they're very young, faced with the tragic consequences of some disease, whether it's cancer, but most people that die of a natural cause disease, when we go to that crime scene, the loved ones and family can show us documentation that this person had been seeing a doctor, something to show that we were aware of this. Most people don't die when they're young, so when we have somebody that has passed away, remember, we expect that from people that have reached, later in their life, older in age. Natural causes is just that at the point in life they have diseases, they passed away. Typically, people that die of natural causes, they tend to pass away in their own home, in their own residence. So just for the plain fact that if we come across a dead body anywhere other than the home, it becomes a little suspicious, equivocal in nature. We're going to be scrutinizing this much more in greater detail. It's not to say that you can't die of natural causes out in the environment, but typically people that die of natural causes do tend to die in their own home. So we look at these types of things when we put an investigation together. We're trying to decide whether or not violence has occurred. We use the term foul play. In many instances, we're not going to know what's supposed to be normal in the crime scene. A good investigator brings somebody in who is well aware of the surroundings. They know this house, they know this building, they know what's supposed to be there, and they know what's not supposed to be there. So we're going to rely heavily upon witnesses and people that understand those different things. We look at many different layers of evidence with death investigations. We talk about the wounds on the body. When we see somebody that has passed away, when we're trying to determine how, we look at the different types of wounds that could be on somebody's body. We look at wounds, for instance, that are incised, an incision, as opposed to lacerated. Incision typically means something was punctured, something was placed into the body, whereas lacerated wounds tend to be slashes, cuts. So we look at these types of cuts that are on the body. We look at contusions. Contusions are nothing more than bruising. Severe bruising, contusions could be days, weeks, of if we are there in the crime scene, we can see different time periods of these types of bruises. Abrasions, again, abrasions tell a big story. This particular type of wound will tell us whether or not the body had been moved, for instance. As we're looking at this death investigations, we're going to be asking ourselves in many cases, was the person killed in this location, or did somebody kill them and move them to this location? Abrasions, in many times, will help us answer that specific question. Abrasions are like rug burns, and really depending on the time of death, the abrasions will present differently depending on what's happening. And then we have gunshots. We have, certainly in the United States, we have a lot of crimes based on the use of guns with regards to death investigations, certainly suicides. We certainly could have accidents, uh, but in most cases, we're going to be looking at an enormous amount of evidence based on the gunshot wounds to the body. And we're going to be looking at the ballistics based on that, and really based on the age of the wound on many things. When we start to look at these specific things on the body, what we tend to rely on is what's called an autopsy. An autopsy will generally, in most jurisdictions, be performed at the request of the detectives, investigators, but by the coroner's office. When we use the term coroner in most jurisdictions, it's an elected official. The coroner is tasked with two major duties. Number one, it will be the coroner's job to decide how this person died. Of the four ways that we talked about previous, how did they die? And the coroner will answer that question. We then ask the coroner to help provide evidence on the time of death. Time of death is extremely important when we're trying to decide on a suspect and honestly rule out people that will not be a suspect in that particular crime. So in an autopsy, I want you to remember that although we gather evidence, including the body from a crime scene, that body will later be taken to the coroner's office, and autopsy will be performed. And that autopsy is an extension of that crime scene. Everything that we determine from the body at that later event, we consider that still part of the crime scene. We're looking for additional clues and evidence that could occur based on a closer examination of that body. So in an autopsy report, as an investigator, we typically want to see, what was the cause of death from the coroner's office, what their opinion is. If it was a substance or substance causing that death, the nature of the fatal wounds and the injuries. Give us the nature of those wounds. We're certainly going to want to know the time of death, and we'll get into that TOD, time of death, and some of the basic things that the coroner's office will use to determine that time of death, and whether the scene where the body is at is the crime scene, or whether is it a secondary crime scene where the body was placed. We want to see this in that autopsy report. We also at this time want the coroner to give us any evidence that there was a chronic illness. If someone did die from natural causes, we should have some evidence from the body. We should be able to see that there is certainly a chronic illness or disease that this person was facing. Even if they had never been to a doctor, we should see the significant nature of that disease progressing in the body, and we should get that from the autopsy report. Many times we'll have an autopsy report. We'll look into chemical substances that are in the body. So we'll ask for to see if there's anything inside of the body that we need to be concerned about. We'll look at evidence of the body, of blood, trace evidence, things like skin, other than the victims, somebody else's DNA on them. We certainly are going to look at all types of things, assuming in many cases that a sex crime could have been committed. So we're looking for those trace evidence, DNA evidence that might support that idea. We have to always be thinking that there's, and asking the question, is there any evidence of sexual crimes on this, death investigation? We want to put this together in that autopsy. So determining the death has occurred, we're going to try and put a story together, whether it was an accident, and if it was in fact a homicide and we determine it to be a criminal homicide, we're going to have to start answering questions. Number one, the investigator typically doesn't call or actually say someone has expired or someone has died. Typically, medical professionals will be on the scene in many crime scenes, and they look at three vital functions to see if all three if the three are not operating, then we declare the person to have been deceased. We look at the three vital function as the heartbeat, respiration, and then brain activity. Signs of death, when you're on the call as a detective, we don't teach a lot of special agents in the FBI or police officers a lot of medical care. because quite simply, we have a lot of professional medical folks out there, from fire personnel to the EMTs. But when we're there on the scene, and if there's nobody else there, we do look for those signs. Do they have a heartbeat? Do we have a pulse? Are they breathing? Is the chest rising and falling? Clearly we're going to have a difficult time determining in some cases when people are struggling to survive. I tell many of my detectives that the simple method of just squeezing the fingernail, when you grab somebody's fingernail and you just squeeze it, and then when you look, do that to yourself. When you see the fingernail flush and then come back, then we know there is some circulation. So many times when the heart rate is so insignificant, you can barely see, look for those things like flushing of the fingernails. Sometimes that will help. In most cases, especially if you're not sure, make sure the number one thing you do is get medical professionals to that crime scene to determine, do we need to help this person? The checklist for the investigation of a criminal homicide, really, quite honestly, in most cases, the hardest thing for us to do as an investigator is really identify the victim. In many cases, we don't know who the victim is. We don't have ID on them. So we're trying to determine, who is this person that I've come across, whether it's in a vehicle, whether it's out in the outdoors, wherever this person is. In many cases, we need to find out, who is this person? And there are many steps that we can go through, from looking at fingerprints. Clearly, depending on the age, how long till discovery of the body, the fingerprints are only going to have a short window that those prints are viable. If they're not, we have somebody that's been in the outdoors for weeks and weeks. The body is decomposed. We'll start to look at dental work. Look at specific dental work to identify the body and identify who the person is. If we have no specific dental work, we then move on to bones, significant breaks in the skeletal structure, or any kind of metal screws or plates on the body based on many different surgical procedures. So we would go to those extremes when the body is decomposed, because we're trying to identify who was the victim. Many of the unsolved cases that we have for homicide, murder, we certainly know that the victim has died as a result of criminal murder, but we just don't know who the victim is. Trying to put a suspect together in many of these murder cases is not that difficult, given that in the United States, domestic violence is extremely high. We have a lot of occurrence of domestic violence, and in many states, like the one we're in here, murder is probably about 50% of the domestic violence rates of somebody that does die as a result, somebody that they knew. So once we identify the victim, we tend to be able to quickly put together a list of suspects, the people that they know, they surround themselves with. Who are they living with? Who are they in love with? It is unusual to have a stranger murder suspect. Does it occur? Absolutely. In most cases, though, the murder suspect tends to be someone close to the victim. So ID in that victim is extremely important. Stage 2 of the investigation, once we've ID'd the victim, is really establishing that TOD, or time of death. I'm only really going to talk about a couple of things that we tend to do. A lot of it has to do with how quick are we on the crime scene? How old is this crime scene? How long has the body been left in this environment? Is that environment outside? Is it at room temperature? So again, there are many, many different things that we look at when we're in this crime scene. The PMI, or post-mortem interval period, is important. That PMI is really nothing more than the time period between death and when somebody called us to report the body. That time period that between those two. How long has the person been here, dead, until we were notified of this? That window of death. We look at algor mortis. A lot of people know what rigor mortis is. Rigor mortis is the idea that when your body ends, like all biological things, you start to stiffen. The body, when it dies, starts to become acidic, starts to stiffen, and there's a time period where we have what we say that is the maximum time period. You've seen this for just things that were hit on the side of the road, whether it's an animal, a deer, and you see these animals that are really stiff. That rigor mortis gives us a time period. Algor mortis is the idea that when somebody dies, human beings, we know that when you die, your body will cool down to room temperature. And we know mathematically that in room temperature, the human body will cool down to about 2 to 3 degrees in the first hour after death. And it's about 1 to 1.5 degrees every hour afterwards. So if we roll into a crime scene and we take a temperature of the deceased, it gives us a good time period of when do we believe this person passed away based on algor mortis by simply deducting the mathematical numbers where we're at this point from the temperature gauge that we have on the body. And it will keep coming down until that body hits room temperature. Remember, people that expire out in the wilderness, in the rain, in the water, in snow, everything's going to change. Algor mortis is more about room temperature, more about a crime scene that we're on very fast. The victim hasn't been deceased that long. So we have algor mortis, we have rigor mortis. And then we look at this idea of lividity or post-mortem lividity. Lividity is, really the idea, think of Easter eggs. You take an Easter egg and you dip it inside and you pull it out and you see that distinctive line on the egg. When the human body ceases to exist and we expire, all of the blood in our body, based on gravity, will then, based on gravity, pull down to the lowest point, all of that blood. So if somebody, like in this chair that I'm in right now, if something were to happen, I have a heart attack and I was to die, all of the blood in my body would then start to go to the lowest point of my body. Someone that has died and we're there in the crime scene and it hasn't been that long. Because remember, like I said, everything has a time period. We know that with lividity, that the max lividity, when we can see that distinct coloration of the body, we know that's about 10 to 12 hours. So if I had a heart attack in this chair and someone didn't find me or someone didn't notify the police for about 8 hours, when the police and investigators show up, and let's say they get there within 10 hours, this is the max for lividity, they would expect to see that discoloration from my buttocks down to my legs. All that blood has pooled down and it would be filling up my legs. Looks like a dark bruise from my feet all the way up. So we would know, because once we see that discoloration, we know exactly the way the body was when they died. So if somebody was to take me and throw me in a car and move me, 8, 9 hours after I died, and as the detectives get there and they can see the lividity on the buttocks and the legs, but I'm laying down on the ground, they would know something ain't right here. If you died laying down, the blood would be on the entire body towards the back. So we look at the discoloration, the blood. It tells a big story. What was the position of the body when the person died? But that story has to be told within a certain time period, because the body will putrefy and we will start to deteriorate. And really that max lividity, especially if it's outside in the desert where I'm from in Las Vegas, out there, we have a very, very short window. The body will decompose very, very quickly. The body will turn and be discolored by the sun, extreme heats. So just like with rigor mortis, we know that the human body in, room temperature, the max stiffness, if we come across you in your house and you've died as a result of a heart attack and you are extremely stiff, rigor mortis, we know that's typically 14 to 20 hours. So when we get there and you're not stiff and you're not that cold, remember we talked about the temperature and you're not stiff, and there's really not a lot of discoloration, then we would look at that as a pretty fresh crime scene, that the deceased has not been gone that long. So it tells us a big story about how we find the body and how it's presented to us when we roll into that crime scene. Remember, when we look at blood, the whole idea of blood spatter, kind of like the TV show Dexter, The blood spatter evidence is going to help tell a story if it's a violent encounter, helping us through the crime scene. Just like when we look at the fingerprint to identify victims, it helps us tell a story about what happened into this crime scene. Certainly, we're going to look at the contents of his stomach. We do that in an autopsy, and a lot of different things way beyond the scope of this class. At this point, just understand we do look at a lot of different things based on how the body starts to decompose and how does it change. We have experts, forensics experts. If we find bodies that have been buried out in the desert for a week, 2 weeks, we can certainly bring in experts that, based on the age of the maggots and the flies, lots of different things in that shallow grave, can help us determine that in order for those flies to be present and the maggots, this person had to be in the ground for this period of time. There are lots of different ways to determine what we decide on the time of death. Everything has to do with environmental factors, so never forget about the environmental factors. So after we determine the time of death, we move on to stage 3. In stage 3 is where we try and establish the cause of death. Remember, that's going to be ultimately determined by the coroner, but we're trying to establish the cause of death at this point once we've gathered all of the forensic evidence together. Remember, we're using inductive reasoning. Once we establish the cause of the death, we then try and identify if it is a criminal homicide, identify the suspect that is responsible for the death, whether it's murder or whether it's manslaughter. So stage 4 is IDing the person that's responsible. And then don't forget about stage 5. As an investigator, you have to prepare and put that case together. All the evidence presented in the best way you can to help perform the duties of the prosecutor and trying to go after the person responsible for that death. Remember, for the most part, most jurisdictions, it is not the job of an investigator or the detective really to decide on the motive. Really the reason for doing that might be something that the prosecutor gets involved in. But for us, we have to determine actus reus and mens rea, meaning did a crime happen? Meaning, did the state of Utah say you can't do this? We have to show that there is statutory regulations saying do not do this. And then we have to put the elements of the crime together, things that you did and you knew you were doing that caused the death of this individual. That's our job. The reason for doing that really is not our job. Certainly, when we're trying to talk to that suspect, and in many cases we're trying to get their reasoning behind this, if they're willing to talk to us after they've been Mirandized, and if they're willing to try and explain to us this is why they did it, the motive, yes, we are going to write that down. We're going to document it for later purposes in court. But for our purposes, we have to worry on the elements of the crime, and the statute exists to show that we made a legitimate arrest for that particular crime. Most of the time, motives for murders, it's a lot of relationships that are involved. When we start looking at things that we see in the news, a lot of things that we don't typically see a lot of. We see it in the news, we make movies about them. So we're going to at least talk about that, and how we define them. When we talk about a multicide, the whole idea that somebody kills more than one person, it's the killing of, more than one person. We use the term like mass murderer. If we describe somebody in the investigative world as a mass murderer, it's someone that has committed a homicide of 4 or more victims during a single event. Remember, that's important. A single event. They've killed 4 or more people in one location. We call that person a mass murderer, as opposed to a spree murder. A spree murder is when somebody kills 3 or more people in a relatively short period of time, but it can be in different locations. Someone commits a crime, committing a homicide, they're running from law enforcement, they kill somebody else. So when we see 3 or more, but in different locations, short time period, we call this a spree murder. And this is quite different than a serial murder. A serial murderer is someone that kills 2 or more people. When they kill 2 or more people and they have a gap in the time frame between the killings, so they typically act alone, but they can act with somebody else, and they commit multiple homicides, but over a period of time, there's a time difference between the two, a break. We typically call this person a serial murderer. Couple of points to bring out. Certainly when we use inductive reasoning, especially with suicide, I told you earlier that in many cases, we don't have notes. We don't have a note. Don't expect to have a note every time. When we use the term strangulation, a lot of times this becomes confusing, but what we're really looking for in strangulation is signs that the neck was compressed. Compression of the neck shows signs of strangulations. We're certainly, in the chapters you're reading for this week, we're going to be talking about violent crime. We're going to be talking about many of the violent sex crimes with regards to the homicide. In many cases, we're always looking for sexual violence at the same time. When we look at the Department of Justice and when we make a decision on what's the most serious crime, remember, victims can be victims of many different crimes. They can be victims of a sex crime, violent rape, but also become the victim of a murder. We typically, the Department of Justice, will take statistics on the most serious of those events. So we're going to get limited on a lot of the data. When we see the data on the uniform crime reporting in many jurisdictions, we're going to lose a lot of crimes that were rapes in jurisdictions, because if that victim ultimately was killed, we're going to show it as a homicide, a murder, and not capture the whole idea that the sex crime occurred of rape. So that is certainly a limitation with the data that we compile. It's also pretty confusing for my students, and I know I'm going to get some emails with the laws that we passed lately called stand your ground laws. Stand your ground laws are laws that many states have passed. And again, I'm not going to get into the politics of this. If your state has passed a stand your ground law in the past for purposes of self-defense, meaning you were allowed to take the life of another person, we don't call this a criminal homicide. You had the right to protect yourself if you feared for your life or somebody else. Stand your ground laws complicate the investigation in that in many states, you, as the victim, do not have to leave the space you're in. You do not have to retreat. You can stay where you're at, and if the person that is trying to hurt you continues, there doesn't have to be an element that you had to try and escape. You can stand your ground and protect yourself. So the idea of stand your ground laws are all about, we don't have to prove anymore in those states that the retreat needed to be there prior to you taking somebody's life. In some states, it does. In some states, before you can take somebody's life to protect yourself or your family, in some of these states, we would look at it, could you have left? Could you have gotten into your car, driven away? Could you have walked away and this never occurred? In those states, we have to answer that question, could you have retreated? So it depends on the state that you live in. Keep that in mind. Death scenes are extremely complicated. Certainly, we're going to be gathering the evidence in every fashion that we can. Every state will have different laws pertaining to when does law enforcement show up on a death investigation. In my state of Nevada, anybody that dies, regardless of the cause of death, law enforcement shows up. Other states like Utah, if it is determined that we have notification by medical personnel that this person died of natural causes, they were on hospice, that we can show that this person died of natural causes, law enforcement might not have to show up and document at all. They would only show up in cases that are equivocal, suicide, homicide, and accidental. So, that's a really, really quick narrative on death investigations. Hope it helps. We'll see you next time.